Y'all looking at the funeral of one Mr. Henry James Anderson, born Wednesday, October 9th in 1861. That was just before us colored folks got our entitlement. And he died Sunday, November 23, 1947. They say a funeral is a ceremony where folks get to honor and celebrate the life of your loved one. It's a time when your friends and family come together to show the love and respect they feel for the person who was important in their life. This celebration of life has been going on for thousands of years, they say. For Mr. Henry's obituary in the Union Spring Herald, that he was not only beloved of the farmer, but when he died, his 10 children, which was 6 girls and 4 sons, was in attendance with his 51 grandchildren and 100 great-grandchildren, along with other relatives and friends. Now I know in his lifetime he had 26 children altogether, and he lost count of how many grandchildren, great and even great-great-grandchildren. Not to mention the nieces and the nephews and their children he had. Lord, folks came from everywhere to honor this great man of God. You see, he was a preacher man, and his family came to pay their respect from as close as Macon, Montgomery, Birmingham, and Barbour County, and as far as Chicago, New York, and Florida. Now, how I know all this, you might be asking. Cause that there, fellas? Yes, sir, that's me. I had a fruitful and productive life, I must say. Now, I was named after my pa, Mr. James Anderson, and he was born in 1818 in Prince George, Maryland. Now, my mom's name is Lucretia Anderson, but folks just called her Mama Creasy. She was born in 1825 in Georgia. She said her name was come after some abolitionist lady. And as far back as I can remember, my mom was a child slave in the Whigham plantation, and my pa was working on their farm and up there in Barbour County till we got our freedom in 1865. Now, don't y'all go feeling sorry for me. I had what I call good life, I got to say. Now, sit back, relax, get comfortable whilst I tell you my story about how a young man, born in slavery, went on to become a traveling preacher, and whose family tried to get reparations for the former slaves, and whose children worked hard to give a legacy that this family could be proud of. My ma told the story about the Whighams. It was Irishmen who left Ireland around the 1740s and rode a ship from there to Georgia around 1788. The Indians were their neighbors, but the white folks was claiming the land and the territory and making it their own. Master Joe Whigham married Miss Elizabeth Hannah. Now, my ma was originally a slave of the Hannahs, and they hired my ma out to work for the other white folks like the Walden. But when her pappy, William Hannah, died in 1831, my ma was eventually sold to Master Whigham because he married Elizabeth. And because she deeded all her slaves to Master Whigham when they got married, that's how we became slaves of the Whigham. Over the years, all the Whigham men had land and slaves. But then, around 1840, Joseph and his brother Thomas Whigham decided to leave Georgia and head to the virgin territory in Alabama that was taken from the Indians. They purchased some land over there, and they brought family and their slaves to Barbour County around 1848, and eventually settled down in the Blue Springs area. Later on, some of the Whigham men even went to Pike County. The Whighams had slaves, and Master Whigham fathered a couple of slaves with my ma. Some of the Whighams was even the overseer of the Whigham plantation and would go from Barbour to Pike County to work the slaves. In 1850, Master Joe Whigham had 3 slaves, my ma, my brother Abram, who was born in 1848, and a 6-month-old boy child. Master Whigham was their pa, but they was living with Master Whigham's pa, old man Joseph Whigham Sr. Now, in the 1860s, Master Whigham had a few more children with my ma. Ernest was born in 1854, and Francis was born in 1858. Around this time, there was talk going around about the war between the states. The folks from the South was fighting with folks in the North so they could keep their nigger slaves. There was talk amongst the local slave owners who were signing up to fight in the Union War for their South to keep their slaves. They was talking about how important the slaves was to the South and how they was willing to do whatever it took. They was talking about, ain't no way we gonna give our slaves their freedom without a fight. Them white folks sold almost everything they had to give money to the cause for the South to keep their slaves. I heard them talking about they even gave away whatever valuables they had in return for some of that Confederate money to help with the cause, because they was told that when the war was over, they could cash them dollars in and they would be rewarded plenty for their contribution. The Whigham men signed up for the war, and the slave owners had to hire more slaves to tend their land now that the men was all fighting in the war. That's when my mom met Papa James Anderson. He was a slave at the Anderson plantation. They had land here in Barbour and up there in Pike near Montgomery. They started courting in 1859, and I was born. All the children was born here in Alabama. Now, Master Whigham, he was a God-fearing man. Every Sunday, him and the missus would go to Sunday service in town, and the Master Whigham felt like it was his Christian duty to teach us and give us some Christian learning, since our souls was already condemned to hell for being niggers. He felt that that was the least he could do. So he called us to his cabin and read us the scriptures.
Honey, where'd that boy run off to?
I saw him head out the back door with those darkies. I don't know what that boy's up to.
Must be off spreading the good word. It's a good thing, actually. We should be spreading the good word as slave masters, teaching the importance over them. 'Tis our Christian duty, after all.
Yes, God did make us the superior race.
And it's good money, too. Let's not forget about that. Remember that mulatta that we got down from Maryland? One with all the farming skills and everything? Cool, it came at a good price.
Yes, well, it's a good thing after you dragged me off to this God-forsaken place.
Now, don't you be blaming me on that bull crap. At this point, blame it on the Yankees.
I wish they'd just go back to where they came from.
Well, it's criminal, I tell you. They should know better not to be telling us how to go on and live about our own lives. And if we hadn't been funding every single penny straight to the Confederacy, Lord knows what would have happened then. But I'm going to tell you right now, as soon as the war is over, we're going to be rich.
That's what you keep saying, my love.
Yeah, well, you can count on it this time.
All right.
On that note, I'm off to go and preach the good word. Don't wait up for me.
I never do.
announcement, he's coming down. In his smartness, he will bring down his praises. He will praise us all.
Well, that day came when the war was over, and the president of the United States told them soldiers in the North, "Done won the war, and us slaves got our freedom."
Hey, did you hear? We is free.
What? We is free. We is free. They won the war. No more slavery. We is free. Yes, Lord.
Yes. But what does that mean? Huh?
Well, now, the first thing my mom and papa did was to take the last name Anderson. They went down to that courthouse to legalize their marriage and make everything legal. So on December 12th, 1865, they did just that. Yeah, they marched right on down to that courthouse in Louisville and recorded themselves as man and wife. Then on July 5th, 1867, the Negro man could register to vote, so my pappy did that too. His name was recorded in the book 4 on page 297. It sure is. My pappy didn't have much, but he had more than most white folks did, and that was considered valuable. They recorded in the town books that he owned a small parcel of land and some Indian corn, and that was more than most white folks had. It was a white man named Calvin W. Finn who went up to Bullock County, which was adjacent to the Barbour County, and they say he married a girl named Martha Mattie Fagan in Bullock County, Alabama, on June 9th, 1868. The Finns had lots of land up there in Bullock County and here in Barbour County. I'll explain why I'm telling you about the Finns in a minute. In 1870, when the white folks came round to record the name of folks living in town, on July 15th, 1870, the family was living near Clayton in Barbour County in house number 381. There weren't too many colored folk that was living in the area at that time, and since we could choose our own last name, we told them folks our name was Whigham. Now, Papa James was 53 and born in Virginia. Mama Creasy, she was 45, born in Georgia. Abram was 25, Alice was 18, Francis was 13, and I was 12. Millie was 8, and Joseph was 4. All the children was born right here in Alabama. Then on August 25th, 1870, that same fella came to the house we was taking care of for the Whighams down there in Cleo in house number 1761. And 'cause he had already come by, my pa and ma told him we was white. Since we could pass for white, that's what they told him. This time, Papa said he's from D.C. and Mama was from Georgia. And all the children were all born in Alabama. But we got recorded by them folks twice that year. Later that year, my older sister Annis met a fella named Gabriel Carter, and the two of them got married on November 10th, 1870, at her father's house. Now, when we all got to freedom, Annis took the last name of her pa, who was Joe Whigham. C.W. Finn was the justice of the peace who married him. And my brother Abraham met a gal named Caroline Thomas. So that next month on December 29th, 1870, on Joe Whigham plantation, they got married too. That next year, in 1871, C.W. Finn, who owned property in the Greenwood community of Bullock County too, was looking for some sharecroppers who would work on his land up there. So the family decided to move to Bullock County to work with Papa Anderson's side of the family who was already living and working in that community on the Finn plantation. My sister Annis and brother Abram stayed in Barbour County. Once the family got settled in the Greenwood community in Bullock, I met this beautiful girl named Lizzie Florence. And after courting for a little while, so on May 9th, 1871, we got hitched. And Mr. W.C. Smith, we decided to get married before I went away to be a preacher man. He was the justice of the peace. He lived in Midway in Bullock County, Alabama. While I was away, the family wrote and told me that Papa got sick and died. And they said my wife Lizzie had moved away from Bullock County with her parents. So for the remainder of the 1870s, I studied to be the best preacher man I could be. In 1880, when the census folk came round, my family was now living in Bullock, but I was still living in Farnsdale in Marengo County. So on June 1st, 1880, them folk came round asking questions about who was living in the house. I was living with the family who sponsored my stay. I told them folks that I was born in Alabama. My mom was born in Georgia, and my pa was born in Maryland. Now on June 21st, 1880, back in Greenwood, in Bullock, Alabama, my ma and younger siblings lived in the Greenwood house of 365. They even recorded my ma as a widow, and she was born in Georgia, and her mama and papa was born in Georgia too. Abram and his wife and family was living next door to them too. My sister Annis was going by the name Nellie, and her husband Gabriel Carter and her family had moved from Barbour to Macon, Marengo County. While beginning to be a preacher man, I met a pretty young feline named Phoebe Fortune. And whilst I was there, we fell in love, got our license, and we got hitched on November 13, 1880 in Farnsdale, Marengo County, Alabama. Once I finished my schooling, when I got ready to move back to Bullock, she didn't want to go, so I had to go home alone. It was now 1881, and when my family heard I was coming home, they decided to have a revival in the High Log Community Baptist Church, and I would be the guest preacher.
Let's go down to the river. 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 There is healing at the river. So much healing at the river. Let's go down to the river. Let's go down to the river. Thank God that we can go down to the river. Amen. At the river, there's healing at the river. Yes, Lord. Jesus is at the river waiting for you to go down in the water. We thank God today that we have a young man that was inspired by God. Yes. They got a word from the Lord. And his name is Reverend Anderson. We want you to greet him right now with a heart of amen. Give your hands.
Look where he brought me from. Look where he brought me from. He brought me out of darkness. Brought me out of darkness. Into the morning light. Look where he brought me from. Look where he brought me from. Oh, look where he brought me from. Brought me out of darkness. Brought me out of darkness. Into the morning light. Look where he brought me from. Oh, he brought me from. He brought me from. He brought me from. He brought me from. I tell you the love. He brought you from. He brought me from. He brought me from. He brought me from. Where he brought you from. He brought me 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 from bondage. He brought me from. 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 Into freedom. He brought me from. He brought me from. He brought me from. He brought me from. Say yes. Yeah. We are free now. I dare you look to the person next to you and say, we are free now. We are free. We are free. Say, we are free. Because we waited on the Lord's time. We're free now. Sister, we're free now. We're free now. Yes, we're free. We went through Israel. We are like the children of Israel. We went through Egypt. Now we're on our way to the land of milk and honey. Somebody shout glory. Say, I'm on my way now. I'm on my way now. Glory.
During the revival, there was a pretty chocolate drop sitting in the front row. That gal was the prettiest filly I ever seen, I tell you. After the revival, we start courting. And on April 8, 1882, me and Lucy got hitched at the C.W. Fenn Plantation in Thompson Station. My sister Millie and her fella George Miles got hitched on July 8th, 1882, that same year, on the C.W. Fenn Plantation too. Then on September 6, 1883, Joseph and Sarah Job got married at her father's home. It was official on September 9th, 1883. The whole family was together, getting hitched and making a life together. Now, everything seemed to be going great for us niggers until June 6, 1885. It was reported that my kid brother Joe and his cousin Ike Pickett, while living on the Bethea plantation, decided to threaten a man and take his wife from him, and they plan backfired when they killed the poor fella. Ike was my Lucy's people. They had their trial and everything, and then they was kept in jail to await their punishment. My brother Joe was sentenced to hard labor up there in Marengo County in the Platte coal mine on February 13, 1886. Now, if my brother's crime didn't beat it all, let me take this time to tell you the story about the last hanging we had in Bullock County in 1887. The story was in all the newspapers, and not just the Union Spring Herald. I mean, the news was reported all the way up there in Montgomery Advertiser. Folks came from miles round to witness the hanging, cause it just didn't make no sense to everybody. You see, there was this couple that lived in the Inverness community named Bob and Mary Jackson. Now, Bob was a God-fearing man in his 80s, and his bride, Mary, was a young quadroon who was 3 part white and 1 part black. She was in her 20s. Folks asked if she was really in love with Bob, but she said she was happy, so we figured that was all that mattered. Now, up the road was a fella named Joe. Joe had a wife and children, but he took a liking to Mary, and everybody in the community knew about it. Folks would see Joe and Mary gallivanting all around town. They would be seen taking walks in the field and near the creek. And 'cause she's a member of the black church here in the community, after services, the two of them would be seen back of the church having private picnics and such, walked down by the creek. It was just a scandal, and everybody in the community knew, and they loved Bob. He'd help out a neighbor in need, so there was no call for Joe to be taken up with his wife. Then one day, Bob decided he would ask Joe to help him with some work on his property, and things just went haywire.
Hey, Ben. Yeah, I got some work I need for you to do. Got some things I need you to pick up around the house. So we can take care of that tomorrow.
I ain't got time for it, boss.
You ain't got time. Hey, look like you didn't have a lot of time, because I heard that you've been messing around with my wife. And it ends. Huh?
I don't know what you're talking about. Okay? I don't know what you're talking about.
What about...
When you gonna die?
Now, after Joe hit old man Bob in the head, he killed him and buried him and burnt his body under a pile of debris. Folks in the community went looking for Bob, and instead of Joe telling him it was in self-defense, him and Mary told folks he left town. When the neighbors went looking for Bob and searched under the debris, they found his body, and the law eventually arrested Joe for his actions. Now, after the trial was held, they sentenced Joe to death. Right before his hanging, he asked for his last meal to be steak, sweet potatoes, and some pudding. When he was interviewed by the law, reporters, and pastors who wanted to hear his story, he told folks that old man Bob had asked him for some help, and when he told him no, he got angry and told him he knew about his wife and pulled out a hatchet. Joe tried to take the hatchet from him, but it slipped and hit him in his head. Folks didn't believe the story because he told a different version of it. On the day of the hanging, he asked his wife not to visit him and told his children he was proud of them. This story had everything in it. Love, lust, murder, you name it, it had it. On the day of the hanging, folks came from everywhere to witness because they wanted to see the man who took the life of their friend. The sheriff walked him to the gallows, and the crowd parted the way and gave them their room to make their way up to his destiny and his fate. It felt like we was parting the Red Sea. Lucy was there, along with my sister Millie, her husband George, and others in the community. That fella Joe stepped onto the gallows and looked out over the crowd. He stood there stoic because he was ready to see Jesus. Some in the crowd was sad because they wouldn't wish this fate on their worst enemy. But everybody in the community was cheering it on because, like I said, old man Bob didn't deserve it. The sun shone down clearly, and we could see that Joe had made his peace with his maker. He was ready for his fate. He looked like he was at peace, so when the gallows door was open, it was the end. That hanging was the last one ever done in Bullock County. Then on February 1st, 1892, they told us my brother Joe had died of periodontal disease in the Platte Mines. They say he was in Marengo County and his complexion was bright ginger cake. His wife and children was living in Montgomery County, Alabama, and he had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. They even recorded he had a scar on his chin. Our children started getting up in age and having their own family. Abraham's daughter Mary Jane married a fellow named Samuel A. Morris. Amanda Whigham married Davis Jackson on December 22nd, 1893. And Sally Whigham married Major Alfred on December 26, 1896. My oldest daughter, Callie Mae Anderson, married Charlie Street on January 15, 1898. And Abram's son Emmanuel Whigham married Fanny Wright on February 22, 1898. When the census taker came around in 1900, the Thompson Station community was called the Greenwood community now. So by this time, my sister Millie and her husband George Miles was living at the top of the Greenwood community in house number 91. George was 44, and Millie was 35 with their son George Jr., who was born in December 1879. My niece Sally Alfred, Abram's daughter, was 20, and her husband Major Alfred was 23. They lived near them in house number 97. Me, Lucy, and the children was living in house number 221, next door to my daughter Callie and her husband Tallis, and their daughter Lizzie Street. They was living in house 222. My niece Mary Jane and her husband Sam Morris with their children was living in house 235. Abram's son Emmanuel was living nearby with his wife Fanny and their daughter Scylla in house 233. My brother Abe was living close to Mama with his wife Carolyn and their children, Elizabeth, Emil, Liza, Callie, and their son Watson in house 235. His daughter Amanda was living with her husband Dave Jackson in the house 237. My mama Creasy was living next door in house number 239. She was 82 years old and born on January in 1818. She was living by herself, but there was family living all around her. My dead brother Joseph's wife, named Josephine, was living in Greenwood too, with her children Jake and Della in house number 298. Their family had to take care of them since my brother Joseph's death in the Pratt mines. My sister Annis was going by the name Nellie. Her husband Gabriel Carter and their children was living in Macon in Marengo County in house number 365. Now, in the summer of 1909, the organizers of the ex-slave pension movement decided to come to Alabama and meet with the new members from Bullock and Montgomery County. Lord, everybody was excited because the organizers were working hard to make sure the government took care of the former slaves who got their freedom from emancipation, because it was only right since this country had benefited from our blood, sweat, and tears just as much as any soldier had fought in the war ever done. So folks called a meeting up at the church in Montgomery for a member celebration that included my mama, sister, and brothers.
Trouble in my way. I have to cry sometimes. Oh, trouble in my way. I have to cry sometimes. I lay awake at night. Oh, Lord, that's alright, 'cause I know that Jesus, He gon' fix it. And after a while, yes, He is. Yeah, yes, He is. Trouble in my way. I have to cry sometimes. Trouble in my way. I have to cry sometimes. Lay awake at night. 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 But that's alright. That's alright. I know Jesus, He will fix it. I know Jesus, He will fix it. After a while. After a while. Trouble in my way. I have the most time. I have the most time. Trouble in my way. I have the most time. I have the most time. I lay awake at night. Lay awake at night. Oh, but that's alright. That's alright. 'Cause I know Jesus, He will fix it. Fix it for my mother. Jesus, He will fix it. Fix it for my father. Jesus, He will fix it. Fix it for my baby.
is Callie D. House, and I am the Secretary of the National Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association of these here United States of America. We are here to induct the folks of Montgomery and Bullock County, Alabama, into our association. Upon joining our association, there will be a member's fee of 50 cents. And at that point, you would be sworn in to become a member of our association, and you will have all the privileges of every other member in our association. As a part of the membership ceremony, you will come before the group and you will state your name, your age, and your ex-slave holder. I will start with the following: Lucretia Anderson, Millie Miles, Abram and Caroline Whigham, and Winnie Job.
My name is Lucretia Anderson. I'm here today with my children and my family. My husband's name was James C. Anderson. And today, as of today, I am 94 years old. I was born in the state of Georgia. My former slave master was Joe Whigham. He was from down there in Barbour County.
Hi, my name is Lily Miles, and I'm here today with my husband, George Miles, who's sitting right over yonder. My mother is Lucretia Anderson, and her brother, Abram Whigham. I'm 47 years old, and my former slave master is Mr. Joe Whigham.
My name is Abram Whigham, but people call me Abe. I'm here with my lovely wife, Carolyn Whigham, who's also a former slave and wants to be a part of this wonderful, marvelous movement. I'm 59 years old, and my pappy, his name was Joe Whigham.
My name is Willie Joe. I am 72 years old. I was born right here in Alabama. My slave owner was Mr. Bird Fitzpatrick. He has a lot of slaves, and he is the judge of this here county.
Thank you so much for your testimony. And at this time, we are going to take up the membership offering. Thank you. And now, I am going to honor each and every one of you with your very own membership and certificate. You are now members of the Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association. Yes. We are so very honored to have you all. And up first, we're going to have Lucretia Anderson. Bless you. And up next, Millie Miles. That's you, baby. And now we have Mr. Anderson. Okay. There you are. So glad to have you. And here you are, Mama, Miss Child. Thank you.
Now the family had grown, and I had children and grandchildren staying with me that needed to be cared for. Shortly after the family had took part in that reparations meeting, my Lucy got deathly ill. So after me and the family tried our best to care for her and she wasn't getting any better, I needed to find a doctor or a root person to get my Lucy well. So I hitched my wagon and folks told me to go on into town and see if I can find somebody to point me in the right direction. I met some fellas in town, and after telling them about my troubles, they told me to go on down to the Kanika community in the Indian Creek and ask for Mrs. Barbour. She would know what to do since they was part Indian. So after heading down there, I came across a woman and a young girl sitting on the porch sewing. But how do I'm looking for Miss Barbour.
What I do?
How do I'm looking for Miss Barbour.
And who might you?
My name is Henry. Folks in town told me you might be able to help me. Or kind of my wife. She's a mighty sick thing.
Well, I am known to have healed members of my family using herbs. My pappy taught me.
But she's mighty near death, seems like to me. And I need some help with these babies.
How many children you got?
Oh, we got 2 hands full.
Well, my niece Shane here. Now she might be able to help with the children. And I can come and see what I can do for your wife.
You ain't got much, my thing.
I don't need no money. Now Shane?
Yes, ma'am.
This is Miss... What you say your name is again?
My name is Henry, ma'am.
It's nice to meet you, Mr. Henry.
God bless you.
Now you go pack a bag. Because we gonna need to go to Mr. Henry's house for about 10 days. Okay?
Yes,
God bless you, man. I'll wait out in the yard.
Okay.
Mrs. Barbour and her niece Shane came up to help me take care of my Lucy and the children. Them 2 ladies did everything they could to help me, but my sweet Lucy lost her fight. The ladies went back home and I went to stay with my daughter Sarah and her family. It was now 1910, and even though I was grieving the loss of my Lucy, I knew life had to go on. I was traveling and preaching from one community to another till I met this pretty gal named Mary Moultrie. My boy Felix met a pretty gal named Louisa Duke, and since my boy was finna marry, we made it a double wedding. So on March 20th, 1910, Felix married Louisa Duke, and I married Mary Moultrie. We was all living in the Thompson community, but right after our nuptials, I realized I rushed into things. So me and her didn't even last a month. When them census folks came around the Greenwood community on April 15, 1910, my nephew Emmanuel was in the house number 222 with his wife Frances and their 8 children. And his sister Emma and her husband Henry Townsend, they was family living in house number 260. Mama was now 106 years old. So my nephew, her grandson Washington Anderson, was living with her in house number 263. She told him her and her pappy was born in South Carolina, but my mama was born in Virginia, and out of the 12 children she had, only 2 was living. My son Felix Anderson and his new wife Louisa was living in house number 286. My daughter Louisa and her husband James Brooks and their daughter Louisa was living in house number 357. And with a few houses down, there was my boy McKinley Anderson and his wife Florida was living in house 362. I was living next door to my boy Kinley in house number 363. I told him I was a widow, and living in the house with me was my daughter Sarah and her baby Rosie. My other daughter Louisa and her children was living there too. My boy Dallas Anderson was 14 years old, and my daughter Sarah was married to Walt Rayborn, and she was living next door too. My sister Millie and her husband George was living in house number 402 with a boarder named David Shedwick. They had been married 2 years, and Millie told him she had never borne any children. Phyllis and Surrey Calhoun was living in Greenwood in house number 455 with their children, Henry, Vaughn, and Surrey Jr. But then on March 3rd, 1911, George and Millie's boy George Jr. took ill and died. He was the only child they had, so that was truly a sad time for them, because Millie raised him as her own flesh and blood. Now, in the summer of 1911, I met a handsome gal named Katie Menfield. I was 50 years old, a farming Baptist and living in Union Springs. Katie was 48. She was a farmer living in Thompson Station and a Baptist. In the presence of her pappy and my family, we got married on August 19, 1911.
I's married now.
This was my third marriage and her second. We settled down in town in Union Springs and made a living there for 3 years, but that one didn't last, so we got divorced. After me and Katie didn't work out, I felt hard for a gal folks knew by the name of Claudia Hatcher, who lived over there in Ridgely. Everybody around here called her Mrs. Sweet. Me and her got together and had a beautiful baby girl by the name of Rochelle. I wasn't ready to settle down, and neither was her at the time, so she let her mama take care of Rochelle. Now that summer, I met a gal named Leslie Bell Coughlin. I was so caught up with being alone that after a few months of courting, we decided to get hitched. So we got our license to marry. I was 49 and she was 26, and we both was farmers and practicing Baptists. All that gal talked about was being a preacher's wife. On September the 18th, 1914, in the presence of her pappy and my brother Abram, as the nuptials began, and I saw her walking in the door, getting ready to walk down the aisle, even though she's a beautiful gal, I got them cold feet when she walked in the front door. I walked out the back door. And that was the end of that. Even though I was done with getting married, I enjoyed seeing my family join in the holy matrimony. Now, Abram's first wife, Carolyn, died in 1911. So he married a gal named Peggy Thomas on December 6, 1911. Other family members got married, like my granddaughter, Lizzie Street. She married a fella named Charlie Henderson on April 5, 1913. On July 11, 1913, my daughter Annis, who was 22, and Anthony Cooper, who was 31, got their license to get married, and on July 13th, they jumped the broom. This was the first time they both been married and living in Union Springs, and although Anthony said he ain't belonged to no church, Annis proudly told them she was a Baptist. Now, Walter Raven, who was 23, and my daughter Sarah, who was 25, finally got hitched on March 3rd, 1914. It was his first marriage, but Sarah's second. They was both Baptists, living in Union Springs, and farmers. Now, on August 9th, 1914, I heard through the grapevine Elizabeth got married to a fella named Johnny Pruitt, but he was going by the name of Johnny Cope. Story was that Johnny asked her mama, Paralee Cope, for Elizabeth's hand in marriage, and she told him no. He then asked her to play a game with him, and if he won, all he wanted was for her to give her blessings for him to marry Elizabeth. Well, her mama played the game, lost, and she had to consent to Elizabeth getting married to Johnny, 'cause you always kept your word. She told them folks she was 19, but she was really 17, and he was 23 years old when they got married. On the Ike Fegan place, my boy Dallas and Annie Mae Rayborn got hitched. On December 23rd, 1916, my nephew Daniel and a gal named Annie Langsford, they got their marriage license, and on December 27th, 1960, they made it official. That same year, the U.S. government required all men between the age of 18 and 45 to register and fill out a draft card. When they came round on June 5th, 1917, my brother Abram's son Daniel Whigham was 24. My boy Dallas was 20 years old when he signed up. Now Elizabeth's husband, Johnny Pruitt, registered that day too. The word round town was he got caught up in some mess, and he started to taking Elizabeth's last name as his own, so he was going by the name Johnny Cope, but we knew his name was Pruitt. On August 29, 1917, the Union Springs Herald published a story saying that Elizabeth's husband, Johnny Pruitt, got in some trouble when old man Dorsey found out that Johnny also went by the name of John Cope, was fooling around with his wife. They said old man Dorsey killed Johnny, but that wasn't the case. Now, when they came round on September 12, 1918, my boy Felix signed up. He was 45, 46. My boy McKinley was 31 years. Abram's boy Emmanuel Whigham was 40. Abram's grandson Benjamin Marlowe was 18. Abram's daughter Emmeline married a fellow named Felix Marlowe. He was Benjamin and McNeil's papa. He was 37 years old. And McNeil Marlowe was 18 years old. Abram's grandson Winston Marlowe, who was Mary Jane and Simon Morris's boy, was 20 years old when he registered. On August 7, 1918, Elizabeth's husband John Pruitt killed a colored fella here and John went to jail. And that left Elizabeth and the girl child she had with him alone to fend for themselves. So since I was divorced and alone, and Mama had done got old and up in years, I wanted to see if Elizabeth would come see about her. So I moseyed on down to Indian Creek to see if they would help me with my mama, and they said they would. On August 8, 1918, they sentenced John Cope, alias John Pruitt, to murder in the second degree. And they sentenced him to 10 years. He was only 26 years old. Elizabeth was so ashamed, she started telling folks her last name was spelled Coopes, not Copes. Now that next year, on November 13th, 1919, John Pruitt's sentence was affirmed at 10 years of hard labor in the penitentiary. So Elizabeth filed for divorce. Now, before I ever went to see about Elizabeth, me and Claudia, Miss Sweet, got together in 1918. And this year, in 1919, she had a son named James Brown. She was still living here in Ridgely with Maud. After James Brown was born, me and Miss Sweet felt it would be best if we went our separate ways. I met a gal named Beulah Glasgow, so we started courting. Now, on January 17, 1920, when the census folk came round, my boy Dallas was living in Indian Creek in house number 2 with his wife, Annie Mae, and their firstborn, Clifford. And Sarah and Walt Raybone, they was living in Indian Creek with their children, Clinton, Daisy, and Rosanna in house number 197. Now, my daughter Annis died in 1919 from that Spanish flu that was going around, so Anthony was living in Inverness with a gal named Alberta. On September 6, 1919, he married a girl named Birdie Newsby. She was 25 and he was 47, so after they married, he finally got him a helpmate with the children, and not just my grandbaby Annie Mae. Anthony was living in Inverness in a house number 208. She was helping him take care of the children since they were so young. Annie Bate, Lula Mae, Fannie Lee R.C., George, and the baby girl, Dallas C., was just 2 years old. I was 52 when divorced it, and living in Inverness in house number 274 with Elizabeth, who was 24, and her aunt Mary Cope, who we knew as Mrs. Parsour, who was 49. I even took to raising her daughter, Hattie, as my own. She was just 1 year old. And them folks put Elizabeth and Mrs. Parsour down on the record as my servants, since we wasn't married at the time. My boy Kenley was living next door in house number 276 with his wife Florida and their children, Joe, Floran, and William James. On January 2nd, 1920, when the census folk came round, Greenwood was now a community called Thompson Station or Fitzpatrick, depending on where you were standing. My daughter Phyllis and Surrey Calhoun were still living in the Greenwood community with their children, Phyllis, James, William, and Roosevelt, we called her Dud, in house number 54. And my sister Millie was now 59, and George was 57, and they were still living in Greenwood in house number 71. My daughter Louisa and her husband James Brooks was living in Greenwood with their children, Eugene, Susan, James, and Lucille in house number 74. And my nephew Daniel was still living in Greenwood with his wife Anna in house number 171. Now in June of that year, Mama Creasy took ill and suffered for 4 days before she gave in to the Lord's wishes and was called home to glory. My nephew Daniel Whigham was with her. She died on June 25th, 1920, and was buried at the Finn's Plantation on June 26th. They said she was 100 years old, but she was really 108. Now that was a lot of life for a woman. She saw many things in her day, including living with the stronghold of slavery and overcoming it. She helped to try to get reparations for the slaves. She was a great woman who will forever be missed, that's for sure. Now, the family had been on the fence plantation so long, we did our hatching, matching, and dispatching there. Because many of our folks had been buried there, it made sense to bury Mama there with my Lucy. Now, even though I was staying with Elizabeth and her aunt, we wasn't official, so I had a wandering eye. I started seeing a gal named Beulah Glasgow. In 1921, we had a boy named George Edward Glasgow. We didn't work out because I was still grieving my mama, and I realized I was liking Elizabeth more than I had expected. So I asked Elizabeth if we could be together, and she said yes. Now, on January 26, 1924, Abram's grandson, Emmanuel's boy named after Abraham, married a girl named Mary Anna Willis. And just 6 months later, on July 27, 1924, my brother Abraham was called home to be with the Lord. He was 76 years old and had lived a full life. Yes, sir. In 1925, Daniel's wife Annie died suddenly. And in April 1926, Sally's husband, Major Alfred, died suddenly too. Now, in 1926, I was 64 and Elizabeth was 36. We were both living in Inverness, and we realized we was in love with one another from the first time we met. So on August 29, 1926, Lizzie and me made it official and got married. On the license, I told them this was my fourth marriage, and it was her second, even though I know I had been married more times than that. I was 64, and Elizabeth was 36. Yes, I was 30 years older than her. We were both living in Inverness, and we were both Protestants. Now, I was 6 feet tall, and she was a short, ginger cake, pretty young thing. Our children, Jessie, Violetta, Arbel, and Henrietta, was born during these years. After we got married, we moved in family to Aberfoyle community so we could be close to the school. One day, Violetta come home from the school, and I asked her, "Baby, why you home and not in school?" And she said to me, "I went, Papa, but the teacher wasn't there, so I'm not going back." So we just laughed at that. Now it was 1930, and by now you can see that in Bullock and even Macon County, the children of the Andersons, Whighams, Miles, and Carters grew in leaps and bounds round here. So instead of telling you who lived where, I'm going to tell you their last name and where they was living. Now over here in Indian Creek, a few of my children had moved over here, so near me was the Andersons, the Raybones, Maddoxes, Hills, Hawthorns, Smarts, Warrens, Peebles, Christians, and Borders. Over there in Ridgely, we had the Christians, Andersons, Coopers, Peebles, Fords, Adams, and Doxons. In Union Springs was the Williams, Maddox, Peebles, Calhouns, Christians, Delbridges, Fagans, and Youngbloods. And Post Oak was the Smiths, Coolies, and Smileys. In Pine Level was the Andersons. In Pearote was the Warrens and the Rogers. In the Greenwood community, which is also known as Thompson Station, was the Whighams, Willis, Brooks, Nettles, Calhouns, Youngblood, Mims, Darbys, and the Brits. And in Macon, there was the Andersons and the Carters. In neighboring Montgomery was the Andersons. In Birmingham was the Carters and the Raybones. And in Selma was the Stanberries. Now, as far as I can remember, When folks got sick from things like rheumatism, folks around town would just say, you got bad blood, and you need to get you some of that medicine they got in the drugstore. Then, around 1929, a spell the white folks called syphilis was making folks in the community sick. Folks heard if they used arsenic, it would help cure it. But then some folks was using too much, so they was killing folks off, trying to use that stuff since that spell was affecting folks' blood. Us niggers just called it bad blood. In 1931, they were saying that the bad blood pandemic was spreading, and it was just as bad as TB and cancer because they ain't have a cure for it yet. It seemed like every year the paper was telling folks that get tested because this thing was spreading like wildfire. Now, around 1932, folks up in Tuskegee, which is over there in Macon, was looking for men who would participate in what they called a bad blood study. Macon wasn't but a couple minutes from us here in Bullock County. Now, around 1933, my Elizabeth got pregnant with our boy Ernest, and when he was born in 1934, the doctor said he had some kind of bad blood that would make his legs weak. We didn't know what had caused it, but we just had to do what we had to do to try to take care of him. Now, while they was working with them fellas up there in Tuskegee, many of us in Bullock, and especially over here in the lower half of Inverness and Indian Creek, didn't know much about what they was doing up there in that college until the white doctors and folks at the health department around here started asking all the white folks who was hiring niggers to get them tested for bad blood. They wasn't asking us niggers if we wanted to be tested. They just figured since us niggers needed the work, having the white folks make us get tested was the best way to get it done. Now, even though the only way to get this bad blood was by having relations with someone, they felt it was a problem affecting everybody in the community just the same. So they set up times at the state health department and the Bullock County courthouse to have folks come in and get tested. We lived over in Aberfoyle, which was on the other side of Inverness in a 2-room shack off of Route 29. All we had was a kitchen, dining room, and 1 bedroom. Lizzie and me slept in the kitchen on a bed, and the kids slept in 2 full-size beds and 1 twin made of croaker sacks and cotton cloths stuffed with feathers to line the bed for comfort. The women folks made quilts and all the children clothes. For holidays, we really only celebrated Christmas and New Year's, and on Sundays, we ate meat with gravy and vegetables if we was lucky. We had an ice box on the porch, and the iceman would come round with a block of ice to help us keep our food cool. Our water was from a well, and most of the time we kept meat in the well overnight to keep it cool till we cooked it in the morning. Now, to make a living, most of us was tenant farmers, just tend to call us sharecroppers. Each year we work our land and gave a portion of the crop to the landowner for rent. I went from town to town, preaching and telling the gospel to all who would hear. I was a traveling preacher going to and fro, spreading the goodness about the gospel of the Lord from church to church. And since most churches only had services once or twice a month, I rotated preaching from one church to another. I took the train if they called me to come there, but my home church for pastoring was a high log in Bullock County. I made axes, hoes, and hammer handles for a living. Lizzie worked for the white families in town like Miss Gladys Reed and many others, earning $5 a day from each of them. Domestic chores like cooking, ironing, and tending to children. On weekends, the children would play ring plays. Those was games a group of children would play while holding hands, like Little Sally Walker or Gonna Let Buddy Out. No, child, no. And after church on Sundays, they would play hide and seek. And on Sundays after church, My sister Millie and her husband George would visit with the family every once in a while. The children loved to see him. My favorite thing to do was going fishing down at the Coopahachie Creek. My children loved to go with me, especially my daughter Vi. I even taught them how to hunt for rabbits, squirrels, and possums. They made for some good eating.
Everybody fishing all the time. I'm going fishing too. Bet your life, your sweet wife, gonna catch more fish than you. Many fish bite if you got good bait. There's a little tip I would like to relate. Many fish bite if you got good bait. Everybody fishing, I'm going fishing. My baby going fishing too.
Between 1932 and 1934, railroads was constantly in need of work and repair. We had the trains that ran through Bullock County that came from as far away as Columbus, Georgia, with connections to either Eufaula or Clayton in Barbour County, or connections in Union Springs, Montgomery, and even on to Selma. The WPA came to town and was looking for men to work and help maintain that railroad. So I joined as a foreman. I was too old to do anything else. One year, they gave me some green cloth and I told Lizzie to make the girls some pretty dresses out of it. Back then, you did what you had to do to make ends meet for your family. I was grateful for the opportunity to see my little girls look good in something their mama had made by hand. As a family, we taught our children how to grow their own fruits and vegetables like collards, tomatoes, potatoes, and the like. I made sure our children knew how to get through the tough times, because that's all we knew. We even growed pretty flowers in the yard. We might have come up from a small town and ain't had much, but all you really needed was your family and the Lord on your side. Yes, sir. Church and family, that's all you needed. In 1937, my daughter met a fella by the name of Johnny Lee Borders. 'Cause she was young, they didn't get married. So her baby girl, Martha May, was born on April 7, 1938. She took her mama's last name, Martha May Anderson. Now, a few years after Ernest was born in 1938, folks decided to go into town and get tested for that bad blood. My Lizzie, folks called her Shane, went with a close friend, and shortly after she got tested, took real ill. On August 3rd, 1939, the doctor came and told us she had only a little more time left on this earth, so we needed to say our goodbyes. I was worried about what would happen to my children because they was young, very young. Because my older children wanted to split them up. My daughter Violetta, who we called Little Sis, had her baby girl named Martha May, who was only 1 year old. Now that she had a child to tend to, it seemed nobody wanted to care for her and her baby.
Papa, the doctor says Shane ain't gonna make it. Now what are we supposed to do about these children? Because I can't be taking care of nobody's children.
Papa, I can't take them kids either. I got my own children.
Papa, you would typically come stay with me.
Dad, we all know some of them children might not be yours. I ain't helping. Name.
While we was trying to figure it all out, little sister slipped into the room to see about her mama. The doctor told us she came down with an ailment that left her with a cyst in her pelvic area, and if she didn't get treated with medicine, she would soon die.
Doc, how's my mom?
Her mother's very sick. She was told weeks ago that if she didn't go see a doctor, things were going to get worse. Sorry, but now she's not going to make it through the night.
No, Mama, the doctor told me you wasn't doing too good.
I know, baby, I know. What you doing there?
I'm gonna wash you up.
Ooh. Now, I need you to do me a favor.
What's that?
I ain't got too much longer, but I'm gonna need you to take care of your sisters and your brother. Can you do that for me?
I can do that. Just rest.
When Vi came out from seeing about her mama, she said Lizzie asked her to be sure to look out for Ernest because he was the baby. Little sister said she would, and she asked her mama if she could wash her up because the cyst was giving an odor. Her mama didn't want her to, but she did it anyway because she couldn't have her laying there like that. I was proud of her. She was only 16 years old, but I knew we had done a good job with her. Later on that night, my Lizzie died on August 3rd, 1939. Back then, there was no wake service for funeral service. If you died at 6 o'clock today, you was buried 6 o'clock the next day. Folks speculated it was the bad blood in her from the time Ernest was born. But all we know, my Elizabeth was gone to glory. We made arrangements, and on the day of the burial, we had a procession that started from my house with some folks walking and others riding in horse-drawn wagons. We marched to the Elizabeth Baptist Church, which was the family home church. My Elizabeth, Shane, was buried in the Elizabeth Baptist Churchyard Cemetery in an unmarked grave over there in the Aberfoyle community. I sung the spiritual because I felt it fitting to sing to my sweet Lizzie on the site of her grave. My favorite hymn was I'ma Sing Everywhere I Go, but for Lizzie, I sung her favorite song. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hill and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain, our Jesus Christ is born. After the funeral, me and Ernest went to stay with my daughter Sarah and her family. They was living in Inverness, up the road from where I was living. I wanted my children to stay together, but I had done got up in age. Violetta went to stay with her grandpa Peter Cope and Aunt Molly Cope for a spell in Aberfoyle. Red and Arbel, although they was young, stayed together so they could look out for one another. They roomed with one of the doctors, helping him so they could stay in the room off of his office. All that happened in 1939. But by the time Christmas come around, the children wanted to come back home, so I told them they could. Now it was 1940, and this time when them census folk came around, I was almost 90 years old and a widower. Them folks didn't believe all the children was mine, especially the younger ones, so they wrote down that I was 80 and that Jessie, Violetta, and Arbel was my children, but Henrietta and Ernest was my grandchildren. I didn't argue with them folks. I knowed who my children was. I was living in house number 69 in Indian Creek. My daughter Sarah and her husband, Walt Raybone, was living in the house next door, number 70, so that thing worked out just fine. Yes, our family was living all over Bullock, Macon, Montgomery, and neighboring counties, making our homes here, raising the children, and contributing to the growth of the community, so I'm not going to keep rattling on about how large our family was. By now, you get my point. One of the biggest things that happened in 1940 was my sister Millie Miles died. Lord, that was a sad day for me. She died on July 24, 1940. My son, James Brown Raven, by Mr. Sweet, married a girl named Vivian Owens on December 19, 1944. Maud Rayburn had done a fine job of raising my children as his own. Henrietta met a man named Marcine Sistrunk. He lived in Rover, Alabama. Marcine told her he would take good care of her. So on June 28, 1941, they got married. My grandson, Willie James, folks called him Nig. He was a widow, and he met and married a gal named Annie Mae Christian on June 6, 1942. He was my boy Kenley's son. This was his second marriage. Arbel found out she was carrying a fella named Joe Nathan Tinsley's child. So once she found that out, Joe asked for Arbel's hand in marriage, so they got married on May 16, 1942, and moved to Fort Davis up there in Macon County. Her baby girl was born on January 12, 1943. Her name was Maddie Bell Tinsley. She was a pretty chocolate. Now, Violetta met a man named Aaron Van Hoos. He wasn't from around here. He lived up there in Jefferson County. He came to this area for the work. Him and Vi got married on November 28, 1942, and they moved up there to Rover in Macon County. Now, my boy Jesse met him a pretty brown gal named Eula Mae Hill. Her papa was named Green Tommy Hill, but her folks around here called him Tanny. Now, Tanny was my grandfather's Annie Mae Hill's second husband. Her first husband was Maud Rayburn. So when them two got together, Tanny helped raise Annie's children. Now, Tanny's first wife was named Lucinda Haynes Hill, and that was Eula Mae's mama. We called her Noog. So Noog and Jesse got married. I know It might sound all confusing, but we kept it all straight. Yes, we did. So on July 30, 1943, we welcomed her and Tanny's children into the family. My granddaughter, Eugene Williams, that is Louisa and James Brooks' daughter, met a fella named Jimmy Lee Fagan, and they married on December 19, 1944. This was marriage number 2 for both of them. Then in early 1947, both Robert and Arbel decided they wanted to be together. So they got their license and told folks they was widows. They went and made it official on April 19, 1947. Robert was living in Macon, working at the pulpwood yard, but Arbel had moved to Bullock. This was marriage number 2 for both of them. They had another baby girl named Beatrice. She was born on November 9, 1944. Now, between 1940 and 1947, when World War II was going on, they started drafting for colored men to register for the war like they did for World War I. The men in the family that registered this time was Abram's grandson, Jimmy Lou Whigham, registered over there in Chicago where he lived with his papa, Daniel Whigham. He was registered on October 16, 1940. He was 26 years old. On October 16, 1940, here in Bullock, Jesse Whigham, Emmanuel's grandson, was 34 years old when he registered. He was living at Fitzpatrick. William James Anderson, we called him Nig. He was my boy Kinley's son. My grandson Joe Anderson was 28 when he registered. They said he had a small scar on his right eye and on his lip. Now Thomas Keyes Jr. was Abram's grandson by his son Emmanuel Whigham's daughter. He was just 20 years old when he registered. He was living over there in Montgomery when he registered on April 1st, 1941. Emmanuel's son, Abram Whighams, was 37 when he signed up on February 14, 1942. Ernest Smiley Whigham was my great-nephew Abram's grandson. He was 41 years old when he registered on February 16, 1942. My son Jesse Anderson was now 21 and working for Howard Mims when he registered on February 16, 1942, living in Union Springs. Abram's grandson, Daniel Whigham, he was 48. He was living over there in Chicago. Word got back to the family about him registering over there. James Morris was my sister Mary Jane Morris's son. He was 28 years old, living in Bullock County. Now, Abram's great-grandson, Abram Jr., was just 18 when he signed up on January 13, 1943. His brother Owen Keynes registered too. He was 19 years old, living with his parents in Fitzpatrick when he signed up on July 6, 1940. Now, my family didn't realize I had bought 7 marriage licenses, but only married 6 times. Elizabeth, who we call Shane, was my last wife, but not all of them knew I had other children. When the children got older, I would take them with me, and the other children's mamas would let them play with one another and spend time together. Shoot, I even had Vi and Jessie to play with their sisters and brothers I had by Miss Sweet and by Dot Glasgow. While the children was playing with the children, I was playing with the mamas. I must admit I had a long, fruitful life. I lived through slavery and the Reconstruction that happened just after we was freed, and I went all around the South preaching and sharing the gospel. I even had my share of the ladies. I got to see my children, grandchildren, and even great-great-grandchildren have families of their own. I loved each and every one of my children. I especially made sure Violetta knew who her family was. She thought I didn't see her sneaking around the house and crawling under the porch and listening to us talk about it. I did. I made sure they knew one another, no matter how they came to be. Yes, God sure was good to me.
Henry Anderson, colored resident of the Aberfoyle community, died Sunday morning, November 23rd, 1947. He was born October 9th, 1861. Funeral services were held Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock at the Elizabeth Baptist Church. He leaves to mourn 10 children, 6 daughters, and 4 sons, 51 grandchildren, 100 great-grandchildren, and a host of relatives and friends. Sleep on, Anderson, and take your rest. We loved you, dear father, but God loved you best. Yes, it was a sad day and time for the family, but life had to move on.
Jesus, wrote me a letter. He said, son, come on home. Jesus, wrote me a letter. He said, son, come on home. Yeah, Jesus, wrote me a letter. He said, son, come on home. Jesus, wrote me a letter. He said, son, come on home. Yeah, Jesus, wrote me a letter. He said, son, come on home. That's what he said. You got a resting place. You got a resting place. You got a resting place. He said, servant, come on home. Yeah, Jesus, wrote me a letter. He said, servant, come on home. Oh, Jesus, wrote me a letter. He said, servant, come on home. This is what he said. You got
how sweet the that saved a wretch like me. I was, but now I'm found. Was mine, but now I see.
Even though the slaves were freed almost 100 years earlier, life in the South was still difficult depending on where you were at. The primary factors for migration among Southern African Americans were segregation, indentured servitude, convict leasing, an increase in the spread of racist ideology, widespread lynching. Nearly 3,500 African Americans were lynched between 1916 and 1970, and because of a lack of social and economic opportunities in the South. So as early as 1920s, as the families grew up in age, many chose to pack up their belongings in search of a better life. Some moved just a county or two away. and others hopped a train looking to go far north or deep south to places like Florida. Many folks migrated there for migrant farmer type of work, especially in the summer months. Some went to Georgia. It seemed somewhat progressive than Alabama. Other than Georgia and Florida, it seems most felt like the farther north you went, the more opportunities you could find. So families went to states like Illinois, Ohio, both were the auto industries. New Jersey, the industrial industry. Michigan had automobile manufacturers, especially over there in Detroit. So many folks moved up there. And New York. Rochester was known as a conduit on the Underground Railroad, so it made sense that many people desired to see what opportunities were in store for them up there. After Henry died, his grandson Dallas Anderson Jr., known by friends as Sam and by close family as Cornbread, moved to Rochester, New York from Florida. He worked on the railroad, and he was a migrant worker, so he would work in Florida in the fall and then go to Rochester, New York in the summer. After getting established, he paved the way for his family to come to Rochester by sending for his sister Leela Mack, known affectionately as Honey. By 1960, most of his siblings had moved to Rochester following him. Some did stay in Fort Davis, Alabama. Also in search of a better life for her mother and siblings, Martha May, known as Mup to her family. She was Violetta's daughter, and she decided to relocate from Macon to Rochester, New York, where her cousin Cornbread brought her to Rochester from Macon in 1963. After getting settled, she sent for her mother and siblings, so they rode the Greyhound bus to their new life. Henry's granddaughters, Honey and Coot, looked after the family once they arrived in Rochester. And with the help of the Anderson clan, they all prepared for a new life here in the North. With some of the family taking root in Rochester, New York, a great place to work was for Strong Memorial Hospital. So Leela Mack, Henry's granddaughter, and Violetta, his daughter, began to work there in the 60s. Working during the 60s through the 70s, even here in the North, still posed a challenge because racism still existed. However, in the North, it seems there were always people willing to work for the greater good of others. In the fall of 1972, Local 1199 held campaign rallies to educate workers about the benefit of uniting and forming a union. Henry's daughter Violetta, having been employed in the housekeeping department, witnessed firsthand the unfair treatment of hospital staff against African Americans employed there at Strong Memorial Hospital and the University of Rochester. The national president of the 1199, Mr. Leon Davis, came to speak with the members, encouraging them to cast their vote, and Violetta made sure she was always in the front row. She shared stories of how she would meet up with her niece Leela Mack and Mattie Bess, who also lived in Bullock County as a child, and how they made up their mind to rally the employees to unite. Then in February of 1973, after casting their vote, they fought and won the good fight. The workers of both Strong Memorial Hospital and the University of Rochester united and voted to unionize and to be represented by Local 1199. Delegates were chosen, the training sessions began, but like others who came before them in the fight and struggle for fairness, they had done their part. Ms. Van, as Violetta was affectionately called, shared stories of how Local 1199 would march on Washington in the spring of 1975, and how they united with other Local 1199 members from all around the country to attend. In 1984, Ms. Van got her granddaughter Delbra into the hospital, where she fought the fight for fairness as a delegate in the union while in her tenure there. In 1984, Local 1199 awarded Ms. Violetta Van Hoos, Leela Mack, and Mattie Bess with the Mack Van Best Award. The willing workers are few, but they can be mighty when they believe in the power of their voice, and they can lean on the strong arm of faith to get them through the tough times. But all in all, it was better to have the union than not to have the union. In 1999, Reverend Norval Goff Sr., president of the Rochester chapter of the NAACP, heard rumors of unfair treatment of colored workers over at Eastman Kodak. Before there can be a change, someone has to step up to gather the facts. So Reverend Goff held meetings at his church to provide the community a safe place to voice their concerns. At first, they met twice a month, and then weekly as the group grew from 20 to 50 and even reaching 130 individuals with concerns. Carrie Rice, Henry's granddaughter, did not immediately attend the meetings. She was concerned about retaliation, but after a time, as the group grew and people she knew and respected had been attending, she finally decided to attend a meeting where she boldly went before the group and told her story. Reverend Goff asked the members if they had proof of their allegations, and it was at that time when Carrie asked her daughter to assist her with gathering and formatting her documentation. At that next meeting, she provided Reverend Goff with her documentation that chronicled her allegations, which included names, dates, and alleged discriminatory claims. With that breakthrough, Reverend Goff was able to begin negotiations with the company about how to set things straight. Yes, Carrie Rice had been a pivotal voice in this fight, because not only had she shared her experiences with Reverend Goff, but she stepped up to the plate and provided proof and documentation that chronicled the struggle she had faced in her tenure there. Many folks didn't know she even opened up her home to provide a safe place for her friends and co-workers to work with her daughter, who helped them document their struggles in the format like her, so they too could provide Reverend Goff with the proof he needed to fight the good fight. Then on May 9th, 1999, on the cover of the Democrat and Chronicle business page, Carrie Rice was interviewed by a reporter where she was asked to share her views about the challenges and inequities she had been facing. Needless to say, that was a proud moment for the family, to see an everyday African-American woman being asked to share her experiences with discrimination in the workplace. Yes, the descendants of Henry Anderson were making their mark in society in their own way, not as entertainers, lawyers, or people you will hear about every day, but their faith and perseverance was making a difference in the lives of others. And that seems to be what I like to call the Anderson Whigham way.
It ain't gonna rain no more. It rained last night and 94, and it ain't gonna rain no more. I love the green and slop and jumps. I love it too. This little goat got no tail at all, but a little bunch of hair going down the path now. Oh, Lala, you keep cool. I ain't got time to teach you now, 'cause I'm busy with this news. Oh, it ain't gonna rain no more. It ain't gonna rain no more. It rained last night and the night before. It ain't gonna rain no more. Oh, the toad frog sitting on the little lady fair, looking up in the sky. Oh, the little fat broke and he fell. He got water in his eyes. Oh, it ain't gonna rain. It ain't gonna snow. It ain't gonna rain no more. It rained last night and the night before. It ain't gonna rain no more. Just to think, I had to say them when I think about it. Get to think. The little lady fair, looking up in the sky. The little fat broke and he fell and got water in his eyes. Oh, it ain't gonna rain and it ain't gonna snow. It ain't gonna rain no more. It rained last night and the night before, and it ain't gonna rain no more. The old side of the grievous slop and the young side loves it too. But the old folk love the grace of God and the young folk love that. Oh, it ain't gonna rain. It ain't gonna rain no more. It rained all night and the night before. It ain't gonna rain no more. And my phone is dead. Well, shall I send you for Valentine? I touched the garden all through and through for a bud to tell of my love and peace. So little love and lady mine, here's my heart for your Valentine. Happy Valentine's Day. For the possum time the salmon tree to see his Jesus, the lamb split and the possum split and he ain't seen Jesus yet.
No, wait, no. Possum up the cemetery, lamb on the ground,
You nasty stinking heifer want to shake the simmer down.
Put your what down? Shake the simmer down.
The possum up the simmer tree, the rabbit on the ground. You nasty stinking heifer want to shake the simmer down.
Shake the cinnamon down? Cinnamon. I said cinnamon. It ain't cinnamon. It's cinnamon.
Yeah, simmer on the tree.
Oh, I guess. Okay. Put cinnamon, I think they call it. We're going to put cinnamon. Okay.
But what about the New Testament? No, that's where they show you where Jesus was walking as a nobody, raggedy, nasty, and all these people sitting outside the road sad. He wasn't saying a word. He was just sitting there. And so, when he got along there, something, tell him a story, something to make him laugh. And when he got to tell him story, they all followed him to Galilee. And all of them joined the church. That's how the stories got started. Yeah, I asked him to give me a guide to go back. Right? And he said, sister, so now, tell me again, what did you asked him to give you a guide to go by, and what he told you? He said, follow Jesus every day. You follow him in the words you say. You follow him in the gift you bring. Just follow him in everything. You follow Jesus in your prayers. Let him lead you everywhere. And he will choose a better way if you will follow him each day. That man loved that today, see? And so, he said, sister, you didn't write it down. I said, I said, when you ask the Lord to give you something, a guide to go by, you got to listen to him. You got to write it down, and well, ain't no use in asking me. No. I said, anything I want, I ask him. And he did tell me. He said he loved it. I said myself, I do too. Yeah, follow Jesus every day. You follow him in the words you say. Follow him in the gift you bring. Just follow him in everything. You follow Jesus in your prayers. Let him lead you everywhere. And he will choose a better way if you will follow him each day.
If I had $100 to spend, or maybe a little more, I heard as fast as my leg would go, straight to the cinema store. I wouldn't say how much for this or that. What kind of dog is he? I get the one with the drooping ears or wag his tail at me. I might buy a parrot, all red and green, and the monkey I saw before. If I had $100 to spend, or maybe a little more.
And action.
Like, why she was hiding her hands?
Because she went to them ones.
There you go. So you can ball your fist, yeah. Have your fist like that. There you go. And then you just start feeding her, and they assume you just feeding her. Come back in the period.
And action.
Get some pies of cornbread. They get the cornbread.
My mama made this cornbread. They just probably shoot the same pie. Mm-hmm. I hope she wash her hands.
They can wash their hands. Gotta make dirt don't hurt right now. Better enjoy my mama pie.
There's some good ass pie.
Okay, so let's hit.
Action. My name is Winnie Joe. I am 72 years old. I was born right here in Alabama. My former slave name was Barbour Fitzpatrick. He owned a lot of slaves, and he is the judge of this here county.
by.